The needle, a sliver of silver, moved with a practiced and reverent slowness through the fragile silk of a century-old gown. In the hushed, climate-controlled sanctuary of the Croft Couture archives, this was Alara Vance's entire world. The air smelled of cedar, aged fabric, and the faint, clean scent of preservation chemicals, a perfume of the past. Here, in the quiet heart of a screamingly modern fashion empire, she found her only solace. Each stitch was a silent conversation with a woman long dead, a whisper of history passed through her fingertips. She wasn't just mending a dress. She was tending to a soul, preserving a story that the loud, transient world above had long forgotten. This silent devotion was her shield, but it was also her cage, and the lock was about to be broken. If you want to know how a single thread can unravel a carefully woven life, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. We continue. At 23, Alara Vance was a ghost haunting the basement of a glass palace. As the lead textile conservator, her hands, nimble and sure, were more comfortable with the delicate bones of a vintage corset than they were with the handshake of a living person. She hid her own striking, unconventional beauty, high cheekbones and eyes the color of a stormy sea, beneath a severe, tightly wound bun and drab, shapeless clothing that rendered her invisible. This deliberate obscurity was a lesson learned from the tragic story of her mother, a former model chewed up and spit out by the very industry Alara now served. Her mother's broken spirit was a constant, cautionary tale whispered in the rustle of every silk charmeuse, a reminder that in this world, beauty was not a gift but a currency, and the price of spending it was often one's own soul. Her virginity was not a mark of naivete or religious conviction, but a fortress built of fear and defiance. It was a conscious, fiercely guarded choice, the last sovereign territory of her inner self in a world that sought to appraise, package, and sell every inch of a woman's being. She had witnessed the predatory gleam in the eyes of designers, photographers, and executives on her rare trips to the upper floors, a transactional hunger that made her skin crawl. To them, a body was a canvas, a vessel for their vision, easily discarded when a newer, fresher one appeared. Alara refused to be a temporary masterpiece. She chose preservation over passion, solitude over submission. Her body, like the priceless garments in her care, was part of an archive, a private collection not meant for public display or consumption. This self-imposed exile was funded by a gilded cage. The Croft Tower, a monument of steel and ambition piercing the New York City skyline, was both her prison and her salvation. Above her, in sun-drenched offices, deals were made, careers were forged and broken, and the relentless machinery of glamour churned on. Down below, in her quiet, subterranean world, Alara worked meticulously to pay for the mounting medical bills of her ailing grandmother, the woman who had raised her, taught her to sew, and instilled in her a reverence for craftsmanship. This single unbreakable chain of love and obligation tethered her to an industry that embodied her deepest anxieties. Every paycheck felt like a small betrayal, a necessary compromise that chipped away at her integrity, while keeping the one person she loved alive. Despite the profound purpose of her work, a hollow echo resided in the center of her chest. She spent her days breathing life back into inanimate objects, coaxing vibrancy from faded colors and strength into brittle threads, yet her own life felt muted and gray. There was a painful irony in restoring the glittering, daring gowns of flappers and socialites, women who had lived with a ferocious appetite for experience, while her own existence was a carefully curated study in restraint. She was a curator of breathtaking lives she would never dare to live, a silent guardian of passions she had locked away within herself. The feeling was one of deep, abiding loneliness, a sense that she was becoming as much a relic as the pieces she so tenderly cared for, preserved but not truly alive. Her connection to the world was filtered through texture and time. She could identify the specific region of Lyon by the feel of a 19th-century silk velvet, or date a piece of lace by the tension of its knots. These objects were her confidants. A heavily beaded Art Deco gown, shimmering under the soft archival lights, spoke to her of reckless nights, of jazz and champagne, of a defiant joy she could only imagine. She would run her fingers over the intricate beadwork, feeling the ghost of a heartbeat, the echo of laughter from a bygone era. This sensory communion was her substitute for human intimacy, a a safer, more predictable form of connection. The dresses couldn't betray her, couldn't demand a piece of her she wasn't willing to give, and their stories, unlike her own, were already complete. The low, controlled hum of the dehumidifiers was the constant soundtrack to her life, a monotonous drone that kept the destructive forces of time and moisture at bay. But today, another sound bled through the concrete walls, a faint but frantic thrumming from the floors high above. It was the chaotic, high-strung energy of the Fashion Week finale, a sound she associated with artifice and anxiety. The distant pulse of the music, the muffled shouts, felt like a violation of her quiet domain. It was the sound of the world she had so carefully walled herself off from. That intrusive rhythm was a harbinger, a crack appearing in the foundation of her sanctuary. It was the sound of a storm approaching, a storm that had a name, and it was about to descend into her world and shatter her carefully preserved peace forever. Her journey home was a daily descent, a shedding of worlds. She would emerge from the Croft Tower's gleaming, climate-controlled lobby into the raw, unpredictable energy of the Manhattan streets, a ghost in the vibrant chaos. The subway ride was an assault on the senses she had so carefully muted all day. The screech of the train on the tracks, the press of anonymous bodies, the cacophony of a dozen languages. It was everything her archive was not. She would grip the steel pole, her gaze fixed on her own reflection in the darkened window, a pale, indistinct figure against the rushing black of the tunnel. Her apartment in Queens was her final sanctuary, a small, quiet space in a brick building that smelled of dust and other people's cooking. It was a world away from the glass and steel ambition of her workplace, a constant, humbling reminder of the chasm between her life and the one she serviced. Inside, the apartment was a testament to her meticulous nature. Every book was aligned on its shelf, every surface was free of dust, and the air was still and silent. It was less a home and more an extension of her archive, a space curated for preservation, not for living. The only splashes of warmth came from her grandmother's legacy. A framed piece of intricate lacework hung on the wall, its delicate threads a map of a more loving time. An old, worn armchair, reupholstered by Lara herself in a soft gray velvet, sat in the corner, empty. These objects were not decorations. They were anchors, constant, tangible reminders of the woman for whom she sacrificed her peace. The silence of the rooms was a heavy blanket, muffling the vibrant pulse of the city outside and amplifying the quiet, persistent ache of her solitude. Her evenings followed an unvarying, monastic rhythm. She would change out of her work clothes, folding them with practiced precision, and prepare a simple, nourishing meal. The act of chopping vegetables, the hiss of oil in a pan, the methodical stirring, these were rituals of control, small ways to impose order on a life that felt increasingly governed by external forces. She ate alone at a small wooden table, the only sounds the clink of her fork against the plate and the distant wail of a siren. After dinner, she would meticulously clean her small kitchen before settling into the worn armchair, not with a book or television, but often with a small piece of mending, a neighbor's torn shirt, a fraying hem of her own. Her hands needed to be busy, to be creating or repairing, to keep the disquieting thoughts of her own unraveling life at bay. The weekly call to the care facility was the emotional fulcrum of her existence. The cheerful, professional voice of the nurse would give way to the frail, reedy sound of her grandmother's. "Elara, my love," she would begin, and Elara's carefully constructed composure would threaten to crack. They would speak of simple things: the weather, a new book Elara was reading, a memory from her childhood. But beneath the gentle current of their conversation ran a powerful undertow of unspoken anxieties. Her grandmother, with the subtle persistence of her generation, would inevitably ask, "Have you met anyone, dear? A nice young man to take you to the pictures?" Elara would offer a vague, gentle deflection, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She couldn't explain that her heart was a sealed archive, too fragile and too valuable to be handled by anyone. After the call, the reality of her situation would descend with crushing weight. She would spread the letters from the facility across her small kitchen table. The elegant letterhead contrasted cruelly with the stark, unforgiving numbers printed below. Each invoice was a monument to her love and her entrapment. The figures were astronomical, a relentless accumulation of costs for round-the-clock care, specialized treatments, and the quiet dignity the facility provided. She would trace the numbers with her finger, feeling the cold weight of them settle deep in her bones. This was the true price of the silks and velvets she handled each day. Her servitude to Croft Couture wasn't a career choice. It was a ransom, paid in monthly installments for the life of the only person who had ever truly seen her. The pressure was amplified by the infrequent but potent judgments of her extended family. Her Aunt Carol, her mother's sister, would call under the guise of checking in, her voice dripping with a cloying mixture of pity and disapproval. "It's just not natural, Ilara, a beautiful young girl like you, shut away with all those old things," she'd say. "Your cousins are all settled. You need to think about your future." Each word was a small, sharp stone aimed at the foundations of Ilara's choices. They saw her devotion as a pathology, her solitude as a failure. They could not comprehend that she was not hiding from life, but rather protecting the last vestiges of her soul from a world that had consumed her mother whole. Their concern felt like another cage, its bars forged from convention and expectation. To endure it, she would retreat into the past, into the one memory that gave her sacrifice meaning. She could still feel the warmth of her grandmother's hands, guiding her own clumsy, childish ones, as she pushed a needle through a piece of calico for the first time. She remembered the scent of lavender and chamomile that always clung to her grandmother's clothes, the soft, patient murmur of her voice, explaining the logic of a blanket stitch, the magic of a French knot. "Every stitch is a thought, my love," she had said. "You are sewing your care into the fabric." That lesson was the core of Ilara's being. It was why she treated the garments in the archive with such reverence. And it was why she continued to pay the price, stitch by painful stitch, to keep that loving voice from fading away forever. Some nights the feeling of being trapped was a physical presence, a suffocating pressure against her chest. She would stand at her window, looking out at the glittering, indifferent skyline of Manhattan in the distance. She saw the endless grid of lights, each one a window into a life she was not living. A life of spontaneity, of laughter shared with friends, of casual intimacy, of mistakes made and survived. A deep, hollow yearning would open within her, a desire for something as simple and terrifying as a hand to hold. In those moments, she would feel the ghost of her own potential, a vibrant, passionate woman locked inside the quiet, dutiful conservator. She was a curator of other people's bold lives, while her own was catalogued, stored, and kept away from the light. This internal conflict manifested in her relationship with her own reflection. In the harsh light of her small bathroom, she would study her face with the detached scrutiny of a conservator examining an artifact for flaws. She saw the high cheekbones and the wide, stormy eyes she had inherited from her mother, features that the fashion world would deem an asset, a currency. The sight filled her with a profound and visceral fear. She saw not beauty, but a vulnerability, a target. In a swift, almost violent motion, she would scrape her dark hair back, pulling it into a bun so tight it pulled at the corners of her eyes. It was a conscious act of suppression, a daily ritual of self-effacement. If no one saw her, truly saw her, then no one could appraise her, desire her, or break her. Her work, therefore, became a paradoxical refuge. The Croft archives were both her sanctuary and the engine of her suffering. As she prepared for another day, laying out her tools, the fine needles, the silk threads, the silver thimbles, she felt a sense of calm purpose settle over her. Here, in the controlled silence, she had agency. She could mend what was broken, preserve what was beautiful, and impose a delicate order on the chaos of decay. The irony was a constant, bitter companion. She was preserving the legacy of an empire that demanded a price she was slowly, unwillingly paying with the currency of her own life. She was the ghost in the machine, the silent keeper of its soul, completely unaware that the machine's creator was about to descend and demand to see her face. The name Julian Croft was a whisper, a myth that permeated the very concrete and steel of the tower. He was spoken of not as a man, but as an elemental force, the architect of the empire's cold, glittering success. They called him the sculptor for his unnerving ability to carve trends from the raw material of culture and to chisel careers into being with a detached, masterful precision. He was a ghost on the upper floors, a presence felt in the impossible standards and the palpable tension that hummed through the building but rarely seen. Alara pictured him as a figure carved from marble, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, his heart, a cold, polished stone. His reputation preceded him like a winter chill, a warning of a power so absolute it had no need for warmth, a man who saw the world not in shades of emotion, but in assets and liabilities. This formidable emotional armor had been forged in the crucible of a devastating betrayal. Years earlier, at the very inception of his brand, his vision had been intertwined with that of his lover, his original muse, a woman whose beauty and creativity he had believed were a reflection of his own soul. But she had been a beautiful vessel for a ruthless ambition. In an act of breathtaking treachery, she had stolen his entire debut collection, his designs, his heart, and nearly his future, leaving him on the brink of financial and spiritual ruin. He had rebuilt his empire from the ashes of that fire, but the lesson was seared into his being. Vulnerability was a fatal flaw, love was a transaction, beauty was a weapon, and trust was the currency of fools. He had walled off his heart so completely that he no longer saw people, only pieces on a chessboard of his own design. The first tremor of the impending earthquake reached Alara as a frantic, distorted voice crackling over a forgotten intercom speaker near the archive door. The muffled chaos from the runway show upstairs, which she had been studiously ignoring, sharpened into a distinct note of panic. Words bled through the static. Unprofessional, breach of contract, the finale gown. Alara's blood ran cold. The finale gown. It was a one-of-a-kind Viennese from 1934, a cascade of liquid silver silk bias cut, so masterfully it seemed to defy gravity. She had spent over 200 hours restoring its delicate hand-stitched seams, coaxing life back into the fragile fabric. It was more than a dress. It was a piece of history, a soul she had personally tended to. The thought of that masterpiece, caught in the crossfire of some vapid, upstairs drama, sent a wave of protective fury through her. The heavy, climate-sealed door to her sanctuary was thrown open with a jarring boom that echoed off the concrete walls, a violent intrusion into the hallowed silence. Framed in the harsh light of the corridor stood Julian Croft. He was not as she had imagined. He was worse. He was no marble statue but a living storm, his presence sucking the very warmth from the meticulously controlled air. Dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light, he was a slash of elegant fury against the quiet order of her world. Alara froze, her hand hovering over a delicate piece of lace. It felt as if a predator had just breached the walls of a sanctuary, his very existence a violation of the peace she had so carefully cultivated. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating against its cage. He moved into the room with a lithe, dangerous grace, his steps silent on the polished concrete floor. His gaze, the color of storm clouds, swept across the room, not with appreciation for the history it contained, but with the cold, appraising eye of a general surveying a battlefield. He catalogued the rows of priceless garments with an unnerving detachment, his mind clearly processing data, not beauty. Then, his eyes landed on her. For a long, breathless moment, he didn't seem to see her face, or the alarm in her eyes. He saw only her silhouette, the slender line of her neck, the width of her shoulders, the proportions of her frame hidden beneath her drab work tunic. It was a look of pure, impersonal calculation, the gaze of a sculptor assessing a block of uncarved stone for its potential and its flaws. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the chilling precision of a shard of glass. The Viennese gown. The model has walked. It wasn't a question or an explanation. It was a declaration of a problem that required an immediate, non-negotiable solution. He took a step closer, and Alara could smell the faint, expensive scent of his cologne. Something clean and cold, like winter air. He gestured vaguely toward the dress form where the silver gown waited, shimmering under the soft archival lights. It was fitted to her precise measurements. Unique proportions. His eyes returned to Alara, and this time they held a flicker of something that made her skin crawl. A dawning, predatory recognition. He had found his solution. He had found his replacement piece of stone. The words that followed were quiet, yet they landed with the force of a physical blow, shattering the fragile shield of her anonymity. "You will wear it." There was no room for negotiation in his tone, no hint of a request. It was an imperial command, an assumption of her compliance so absolute it was breathtaking. The order was a profound violation, stripping her of her identity as a skilled conservator, and recasting her as a mere object, a body to be used for his purpose. He was commanding her to become the very thing she had spent her entire life fighting against, a beautiful thing to be displayed, appraised, and consumed by the ravenous, impersonal gaze of the world she so deeply despised. The air thickened, charged with her silent, horrified disbelief. A storm of rebellion raged within her. Every instinct screamed for her to refuse, to spit the command back in his face and defend the sanctity of her quiet life. The ghost of her mother's broken spirit rose before her, a stark, cautionary specter. To obey was to betray every principle she held dear, to walk willingly into the very fire that had consumed her family. But then, her eyes darted to the small, silver-framed photograph on her workbench, her grandmother, smiling, her eyes crinkling at the corners. The image was a gut punch, a brutal reminder of the gilded bars of her cage. The unvoiced threat hung between them, as real and as sharp as a blade to her throat. Her job, the exorbitant medical bills, her grandmother's fragile life. He didn't need to say it. He owned her world. He owned her. Their gazes locked in a silent, brutal clash of wills. She expected to see cruelty in his eyes, a flicker of sadistic pleasure at her predicament. Instead, she found only an unnerving, implacable resolve. He was a force of nature, a hurricane that did not concern itself with the houses that stood in its path. He saw a problem, and she was the solution. Yet, he must have seen something in her expression beyond simple fear, a deep, wounded integrity, a quiet defiance that burned even in the face of her terror. For the briefest of moments, the cold calculation in his eyes was replaced by something else, a flicker of curiosity, of genuine surprise. It was as if he, the master sculptor, had struck his chisel against a stone and found not soft marble, but an unexpected, unyielding vein of diamond. The moment stretched into an eternity, the silence in the archive humming with a tension so thick it felt like a physical entity. Ilara felt the fight drain out of her, replaced by a cold, hollow resignation. The choice had never been hers to make. With a slow, almost imperceptible nod, she surrendered. It was not an act of consent, but of sacrifice, a quiet tearing of her own soul. A piece of the fortress she had built around herself crumbled to dust. As two severe-looking women in black headsets materialized from the corridor to flank her, she felt a profound sense of disassociation, as if she were watching a stranger. She was no longer Ilara Vance, conservator. She was a body, a tool, a ghost being led from her tomb. And as he watched her go, Julian Croft felt an unfamiliar disquiet, a nascent obsession with the silent, defiant woman he was about to thrust into the blinding light. The blinding white light of the runway was seared onto the back of Ilara's eyelids, a ghost that followed her back down into the hallowed silence of her subterranean world. She had been stripped bare, not of her clothes, but of her invisibility. Her carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered in a few terrifying, heart-stopping moments. Now, back in the quiet hum of the archives, the silence felt different. It was no longer a comfort but a void, echoing with the memory of 1,000 unseen eyes on her skin. She ran a trembling hand over the cool silk of the Vianney gown, now safely back on its form. The dress felt like a co-conspirator in her violation, a beautiful, silent witness to the moment her life had been irrevocably breached. She felt a strange, new energy thrumming under her skin, a terrifying mix of shame and a nascent, unfamiliar thrill. Julian Croft did not return to the sun-drenched heights of his office. He retreated to a dark, minimalist viewing room, replaying the footage of the finale over and over again. The other models were a blur of practiced confidence and hollow beauty. But then she appeared. Ilara. She didn't walk, she floated, a ghost of terrified grace. There was no artifice, no seductive pout, only a raw, authentic reverence for the masterpiece she wore. The way her hands hovered near the seams, as if to protect the fragile fabric, was an act of unconscious intimacy that was more sensual than any runway strut he had ever witnessed. He watched his own face in the front row, his expression one of stunned, unguarded captivation. He, the master sculptor, had intended to use a piece of stone and had instead struck a vein of pure, unmined diamond. The discovery was unsettling, dangerous, and utterly intoxicating. The next morning, a crisp, impossibly expensive-looking envelope appeared on her workbench. It was not delivered by an inter-office courier, but by Julian's personal assistant, a woman whose severe posture seemed to mimic his own. Inside, on heavy cream cardstock, was a contract. It was not a modeling contract, but something more insidious and comprehensive. It offered her a new position: curator of the Croft legacy, a title that came with a staggering salary, a corporate apartment, and the complete, indefinite coverage of all her grandmother's medical expenses. It was a golden key to her gilded cage, a beautifully worded ransom note. He was not offering her a job. He was offering to buy her, to move her from the basement to a display case on the top floor. The offer was a calculated assault on her one vulnerability, a precise and brutal demonstration of his power. Her refusal was delivered in person. She took the elevator to the top floor for the first time by choice, the ascent feeling like a journey into the enemy's command center. The office was a temple of minimalist power, with a single wall of glass offering a god's-eye view of the city below. He sat behind a vast, empty desk of black marble, a king on a lonely throne. She placed the envelope on the desk without a word. Her silence was more powerful than any shouted protest. He didn't seem surprised, only intrigued. "Every person has a price, Miss Vance," he stated, his voice a low, confident purr. "Apparently I just haven't found yours yet." She met his gaze, her stormy eyes holding his. "Some things aren't for sale, Mr. Croft." The quiet defiance in her voice hung in the air, a challenge he was unaccustomed to and found himself utterly unable to resist. He began to visit the archives. He claimed it was for research, a sudden, urgent need to connect with the brand's historical DNA for an upcoming collection. But his visits were a lie, and they both knew it. He would stand for long moments, ostensibly studying a 1920s beaded sheath, but his gaze would inevitably drift to her. He watched the way she moved, with a fluid economy of motion that was both graceful and self-contained. He watched her hands, those nimble, intelligent fingers as they guided a needle through delicate fabric, performing a kind of intimate surgery on history. He was a predator learning the habits of his prey, yet the more he watched, the more he felt an unsettling shift within himself. He was the one being ensnared, captivated by an integrity he had long ago dismissed as a weakness. For Alara, his presence was a constant, low-grade fever. It disrupted the sacred rhythm of her work, charging the quiet air with an electric tension. The scent of his cologne, that cold, clean fragrance, would linger long after he'd gone, a ghostly imprint on her sanctuary. She tried to ignore him, focusing with ferocious intensity on the intricate patterns of a lace collar or the precise drape of a silk panel. But she felt his eyes on her like a physical touch, a warmth that spread across the back of her neck, making the fine hairs stand on end. She was acutely aware of every breath he took, every silent step he made on the concrete floor. Her fortress was being besieged not by force, but by a quiet, relentless proximity that was slowly, terrifyingly, dismantling her defenses from the inside out. One late afternoon, as the city above began to bleed into shades of twilight, he approached her workbench. She was meticulously cataloging a collection of antique buttons, her head bent in concentration. He reached for a small, mother-of-pearl button from the tray at the exact moment she did. Their fingers brushed. It was a fleeting, accidental contact, but it sent a bolt of pure, unadulterated shock through her system. The warmth of his skin was a stunning, living thing against her own. It was a jolt of life, of raw, male energy in her world of preserved, inanimate objects. She snatched her hand back as if burned, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air crackled, suddenly thick with everything they had left unsaid, with a desire so palpable it felt like a third presence in the room. Their eyes met over the tray of buttons, and the carefully constructed distance between them collapsed. In his gaze, she no longer saw the cold CEO or the ruthless pragmatist. She saw a flicker of something raw and unguarded, a hunger that was not just physical, but deeply, achingly lonely. It was a look of profound recognition, as if he were seeing a reflection of his own hidden solitude in her. And he, in turn, saw the carefully banked fire behind her guarded expression, the deep well of passion she kept so fiercely protected. The moment was a silent confession, a mutual acknowledgement of the powerful, dangerous current flowing between them. It was no longer a battle of wills. It was a struggle against a shared, inevitable gravity. He broke the silence first, his voice rougher, less controlled than she had ever heard it. "Why do you hide down here?" he asked, the question more of an accusation. "You could have anything, the world I offered you." The words were meant to be a display of power, a reminder of what she had rejected, but they came out sounding hollow, almost desperate. Alara felt a surge of unexpected courage. "That's your world, Mr. Croft. It's built on things that are temporary, on beauty that fades. I prefer things that last." Her words were a direct challenge to his entire philosophy, to the empire he had built on the fleeting, transient nature of desire. She was not just rejecting his offer, she was rejecting the very foundation of his existence. His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. For a moment, she thought he would be furious, that she had finally crossed a line. Instead, a shadow of deep, ancient pain passed over his features. "Things that last can be taken from you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The statement was not cynical. It was a testament, a piece of his broken past offered to her like a shard of glass. In that instant, she understood. His coldness wasn't a choice. It was scar tissue, formed over a wound so deep it had reshaped his entire soul. Her fear of him began to dissolve, replaced by a terrifying, unwelcome wave of empathy. She was seeing the man behind the myth, the broken boy behind the sculptor, and the sight was more dangerous to her resolve than any threat or command. This growing connection became her central torment. She would lie awake at night in her small, silent apartment, the memory of his touch, the echo of his wounded voice replaying in her mind. The desire she felt for him was a profound betrayal of everything she believed. It was a betrayal of her mother's tragic story, a betrayal of the quiet, self-sufficient world she had built to protect herself. To want him was to want the fire that had burned her family. Yet the longing was an undeniable physical ache, a deep, cellular pull toward the very thing she was supposed to despise. He represented the predatory world of surfaces and transactions, but he was also the only person who had ever looked at her and seen the strength in her solitude, the fire in her quiet defiance. He, too, was caught in a battle against himself. Ilara Vance was an anomaly, a variable he could not control or quantify. She defied every cynical rule he had established for his own survival. He had always believed beauty was a weapon used for gain, but hers was a shield she used for protection. He believed integrity was a liability, but hers was a form of power that disarmed him completely. He tried to dismiss her, to reduce his fascination to a simple, primitive desire for something he couldn't have. But it was more than that. She was a mirror, and in her quiet, authentic world, he was forced to see the profound emptiness of his own. He was drawn to her not because he wanted to possess her, but because a part of him, a long-dormant part, yearned for the kind of truth she embodied. Their encounters in the archive grew more charged, each conversation a delicate dance on the edge of a precipice. They spoke of fabrics and history, but the subtext was always about them. He would ask about the provenance of a gown, and she would tell him the story of the woman who wore it, her narrative filled with a quiet passion that he found himself envying. He was used to women who wanted his power or his money. Ilara wanted nothing from him, and in that she inadvertently demanded everything. She demanded the part of himself he had locked away, the part that could feel, that could trust, that could be hurt. And he found, to his own horror, that he was desperate to give it to her. The moral dilemma for Ilara became a constant, suffocating weight. Her life had been defined by a clear set of principles: preserve, protect, remain unseen. Julian Croft threatened all of it. To cede to the intense, magnetic pull between them would mean stepping onto the very stage she had always shunned. It would mean making herself vulnerable to a man whose world was built on breaking beautiful things. The ghost of her mother was a constant whisper in her ear, a warning of the cost of such a surrender. Was this desire a weakness, a fatal flaw she had inherited? Or was it something else entirely? Was it possible that in the arms of the one man who represented all her fears, she might find, not destruction, but a terrifying, exhilarating freedom? He tested her boundaries not with commands, but with a new, unsettling vulnerability. One evening, he found her restoring a fragile wedding veil, its silk yellowed with age. "Was she happy?" he asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the delicate lace. Ilara looked up, surprised by the genuine curiosity in his voice. "I don't know," she answered honestly, but she was hopeful. "Every stitch in this is a stitch of hope." He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the fabric, not quite daring to touch it. "Hope is a dangerous thing," he murmured, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. In that moment, he was not her boss, not the powerful Julian Croft. He was just a man, haunted and lonely, standing before a woman who was beginning to feel the dangerous, fragile stirrings of hope herself. The conflict reached a fever pitch within her. The world was presenting her with a terrible, clear choice. On one side was the quiet, predictable safety of her life, a life of solitude and sacrifice, but one where she was in control, where her soul was her own. On the other side was Julian, a man who was both the predator she feared and the wounded soul she was inexplicably drawn to. To be with him felt like a surrender, a capitulation to the very forces that had destroyed her mother. But to walk away from him now felt like a different kind of death, a condemnation to a life of gray, muted preservation, forever curating the passions of others while denying her own. The choice was no longer between safety and desire. It was between two different kinds of survival. She began to see him not as an invader in her sanctuary, but as a fellow exile. His glass tower was as much a prison as her basement archive, both of them trapped in worlds of their own making, surrounded by beautiful, lifeless things. This shared solitude created a bond between them that was stronger than their clashing worlds, more potent than their fears. The tension was no longer just about unspoken desire. It was about the terrifying possibility of being truly seen by another person. The question that haunted her was no longer whether she could resist him, but whether she was brave enough to face the woman she was becoming in his presence. A woman who was starting to believe that some things were worth the risk of being broken. The offer from Julian's rival arrived not in a whisper, but as a cold, clinical document delivered by a sterile courier. It was a contract of quiet, corporate violence, offering to solve all her problems with the clean, impersonal efficiency of a surgeon's blade. It promised to pay her grandmother's medical bills in perpetuity, to set her up in a private restoration studio, a perfect, quiet life. The price was simple, a single, devastating piece of proprietary information about Croft Couture's upcoming fabric technology, a secret she had only discovered by accident. Staring at the legal jargon, Ilara felt a profound sense of nausea. It was a choice between two devils, one she knew and one she didn't. The clean, simple betrayal felt somehow filthier than the complicated, passionate bargain Julian had offered. It was a choice she could not make alone. It was a verdict that had to be delivered in person, in the one place where their two worlds collided. She found him late that night in the archives, a ghost haunting her sanctuary. He wasn't working or inspecting the collection. He was simply standing before the Millionaire gown, his powerful shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen before, his silhouette a study in profound isolation against the soft archival light. He didn't seem surprised to see her, as if he had been waiting. She walked toward him, the rival's contract, a cold, heavy weight in her hand, and placed it on the workbench between them. "This is my other option," she said, her voice a low, steady tremor in the hallowed silence. A clean break, no emotional cost, just a simple, straightforward betrayal. Her words were not an accusation but a statement of fact, a presentation of the impossible equation he had forced her to solve. The air thickened, waiting for the final move in their brutal chess match. He looked from the contract back to her face, and for the first time, his mask of cold, imperious control did not just crack, it shattered. A look of visceral self-loathing twisted his features. He saw his own cynical, transactional worldview reflected back at him, stripped of its seductive power, and reduced to this ugly, mercenary choice. He had offered her a gilded cage disguised as passion, while his rival offered a sterile one disguised as freedom. It was all the same. He had tried to purchase her soul, believing it was just another asset, and in doing so had become indistinguishable from the very jackals he despised. The realization was a physical blow, and he flinched as if struck, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him in the suffocating silence of the archive, the one place he had come to feel a sliver of peace. "She did that to me," he began, his voice a raw, broken whisper that seemed torn from the deepest part of him. "The first one, my muse." He finally looked at Alara, his eyes dark with the ghosts of a pain so old it had become a part of his very architecture. "I built this entire company for her. Every design was a love letter. I trusted her with everything. My sketches, my process, my heart. She was my partner." He paused, his jaw tightening as he relived the ancient agony. "The night before our debut, she disappeared. She took every design, every pattern, every piece of fabric. She sold them to my biggest competitor. She sold our entire future for a check. She taught me that love is just the price you pay before the betrayal." Hearing the confession, Ilara felt the last of her defenses dissolve into a wave of profound, aching empathy. The myth of Julian Croft, the cold and ruthless sculptor, evaporated, leaving only a deeply wounded man, haunted by a single act of treachery that had poisoned his entire existence. His cruelty, his need for control, his cynical view of beauty, it was all scar tissue, formed over a wound identical to the one she had spent her life fearing. He was not the predator she had imagined. He was another survivor, one who had chosen to build walls of steel and ice where she had built hers of silence and obscurity. In the quiet of her sanctuary, surrounded by the preserved memories of others, he had finally offered her his own, a fragile and broken relic that she felt an overwhelming urge to protect. The space between them, once a battlefield of wills, became a fragile, sacred ground of shared understanding. He took a hesitant step toward her, his movements stripped of their usual confident authority. He seemed uncertain, almost afraid, as if he had just surrendered his last and most vital piece of armor. He raised a hand, not to command or possess, but as if to simply verify she was real. His fingers, which she had only ever seen signing documents with ruthless efficiency, trembled slightly as they came to rest against her cheek. The touch was not one of passion, but of desperate, grounding contact, a silent question asked in a language of pure, unshielded vulnerability. He was no longer the king in his castle. He was an exile, seeking asylum in the heart of his captive. In that single, reverent touch, Ilara's choice was made. It was not a decision, but a surrender to a truth more powerful than fear. She leaned into his palm, a silent answer to his unspoken question, closing her eyes as she transgressed against every rule that had ever kept her safe. She was her mother's daughter, stepping willingly into the fire. When his lips met hers, it was not a gentle exploration, but a desperate, frantic collision. It was a kiss of starvation, a raw and hungry release of months of tension, longing, and silent combat. It was the taste of his loneliness and her solitude, of his cynicism and her defiance, all consumed in a single, reckless, soul-shattering act of mutual surrender. The rival's contract lay forgotten on the table, a meaningless artifact from a world that had just ceased to exist. The kiss was a sensory deluge that overwhelmed her curated, quiet world. She tasted the faint, expensive bitterness of coffee on his tongue, a stark contrast to the sudden, shocking sweetness of his surrender. The clean, cold scent of his cologne was there, but beneath it was something warmer, more human, the raw, masculine scent of his skin. His hand moved from her cheek to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the tight, severe knot of her hair. With a low groan he pulled, and the pins that held her fortress in place scattered like shrapnel across the concrete floor. Her hair cascaded over his hands, a fall of dark silk he buried his face in. It was an act of profound, symbolic liberation, the unbinding of a lifetime of restraint, and she arched into him, finally, terrifyingly free. What stunned her most was not his passion, but his fragility. As the kiss deepened, she felt a tremor run through his entire body, a shudder of profound emotional release that he could no longer contain. This was not the act of a master taking what he wanted. It was the desperate clinging of a drowning man who had just found a solid shore. He held her as if he were the one in danger of being broken, his powerful frame molded against hers, seeking an anchor in the storm of his own unraveling. He broke the kiss only to whisper her name against her lips, the sound ragged, desperate, and utterly devoid of its usual authority. Ilara. He breathed, and it sounded less like her name, and more like a prayer he had forgotten he knew how to speak. They finally pulled apart, breathless, the silence of the archive rushing back in to fill the void. It was a new kind of silence, no longer peaceful or monastic, but charged with the irreversible incandescent consequences of what they had just done. Her dark hair was a wild halo around her shoulders, her lips were swollen, and her stormy eyes reflected a terrifying, exhilarating fire. His own face was stripped bare, the cold mask of the sculptor gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability that was more intimate than any nakedness. They had not simply kissed, they had confessed, and in that confession, they had irrevocably bound their shattered worlds together. There was no going back to the safety of their solitude. The seamstress and the sculptor had just destroyed their old blueprints and were now standing in the ruins, with no choice but to build something new. The air in the archive, once a comforting blanket of silence, now felt thin and sharp, crackling with the ghost of their collision. Ilara stumbled back from him, her body a live wire of sensation, her mind a chaotic storm. The feel of his lips was a brand on hers, the memory of his desperate grip, a physical ache in her skin. Without a word, she turned and fled, her unbound hair a wild banner of her transgression. She didn't take the elevator but the cold, concrete stairs, each step down a descent into a new, terrifying reality. She had spent a lifetime preserving the fragile threads of the past, and in a single, reckless moment, she had set fire to the entire tapestry of her own carefully constructed life. The world outside the Croft Tower seemed alien, its sounds too loud, its lights too bright, a world she had just violently re-entered. Julian remained frozen in the archive, a statue amidst the ghosts of fashion. He slowly raised his fingers to his lips, the phantom warmth of her kiss, a shocking, terrifying presence. He had not conquered her. He had been breached. The vulnerability he had just shown, the raw confession torn from his soul, had been an act of self-immolation. He had handed her the very weapon that had been used to destroy him once before. His own heart. The control he had spent over a decade meticulously sculpting had crumbled into dust at her touch. A cold, primal panic seized him. He turned and left the archive, striding past his security team without a glance. He retreated not to his office, but to the sterile isolation of his penthouse, pulling up the drawbridge and manning the walls against the one person who had just effortlessly walked past all his defenses. Back in the suffocating quiet of her apartment, Ilara saw her reflection and flinched. The woman staring back was a stranger, her hair a chaotic mess, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a wild, unfamiliar light, her lips swollen and dark. This was the face of her mother's downfall, the face of surrender. The unsigned contract from his rival still lay on her kitchen table where she'd left it, now a monument to a choice she had refused to make, opting instead for a far more dangerous path. A wave of guilt so profound it was nauseating washed over her. She had betrayed her grandmother, her principles, her own carefully guarded soul, all for a moment of connection with the one man who embodied the very world that had left her an orphan. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around herself, trying to hold together the pieces of a self she had just shattered. The days that followed were defined by a silence more profound and punishing than any words could have been. There was no summons to his office, no late-night visit to the archives, no crisp envelope from his assistant. It was as if she had ceased to exist. To the rest of Croft Couture, she was still the quiet conservator in the basement, but to her, the silence from the top floor was a screaming indictment. It confirmed her deepest, most self-loathing fear, that for him, it had been a momentary lapse, a conquest, a raw impulse now regretted and discarded. The passion that had felt like a cataclysm, a merging of worlds, had evidently been nothing more to him than a footnote. Each silent hour was a fresh twist of the knife, leaving her to bleed out alone in the wreckage of her choices, feeling not just broken, but profoundly and utterly foolish. The world's judgment arrived, as it always did, through the tinny speaker of her telephone. Her Aunt Carol's voice, sharp and laced with a morbid satisfaction, cut through her fragile solitude. "I heard you made quite a scene at the fashion show, Ilara. Your cousin's friend works in PR there. They're all talking." The words were steeped in a lifetime of disapproval. "I warned you. This is how it starts. You have your mother's face, and you're going to make her same mistakes. Letting a man like that use you up." The accusation landed with surgical precision, striking the rawest nerve of her fear. To her family, her transgression wasn't a moment of desperate connection. It was a genetic failing, a tragic and predictable repeat of history. The call ended, leaving Ilara shaking, the ghost of her mother's sorrow filling the small, lonely apartment. Meanwhile, in his glass-walled fortress high above the city, Julian was a prisoner of his own making. He canceled meetings, ignored calls, and prowled the vast, empty spaces of his penthouse like a caged animal. Every minimalist surface, every piece of priceless, impersonal art seemed to mock him, reflecting the profound emptiness Ilara had exposed within him. He had spent years believing that emotion was a weakness to be purged, yet the memory of her taste, the feel of her quiet strength surrendering to him, was the only thing that felt real in his entire, hollow life. He was terrified. The feeling was so foreign, so absolute, that it paralyzed him. To reach for her now would be to admit she had broken him. To let her go felt like a self-inflicted wound from which he might never recover. So he did nothing, choosing the familiar agony of solitude over the terrifying unknown of connection. Seeking an anchor in the storm, Ilara went to the care facility. The sterile, quiet hallways and the faint scent of antiseptic were a stark contrast to the chaotic passion that had consumed her. She sat by her grandmother's bed, holding the frail, paper-thin hand in her own, looking at the beloved sleeping face, the reason for all her sacrifices. A fresh wave of shame washed over her. Had she gambled this woman's peace, her security, her very life, on the desperate kiss of a broken man? The weight of her potential irresponsibility was crushing. She had always prided herself on her meticulous care, her cautious preservation of what was most precious. Now she felt like a vandal, having taken a reckless, beautiful risk with a life that was not entirely her own, and the silence from Julian made it feel like a risk that would have no reward. Her grandmother's eyes fluttered open, hazy with medication but clear with a deep, knowing light. She squeezed Ilara's hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "My girl," she whispered, her voice a fragile rustle of leaves. "You look awake." She reached up and brushed a stray lock of Ilara's still unbound hair from her cheek. "There has always been a fire in you, Ilara. You just kept the door to the furnace locked." The simple, profound observation landed not as an accusation but as a validation. She didn't see a fallen woman or a repeat of a tragic history. She saw her granddaughter, finally, terribly alive. The words were a key, turning a lock deep inside Ilara. The fire hadn't just been destructive. It had been illuminating. It hadn't just burned her fortress down. It had liberated the person trapped inside. Returning to the archives, the space felt irrevocably altered. It was no longer just her sanctuary. It was the scene of her undoing and her becoming. She ran her hand along the cool, steel table where the rival's contract had lain, the place where she had made her stand. She picked up a fine silk needle, its silver length cool and familiar in her fingers, and threaded it with a strand of dark blue silk. As she made the first perfect stitch into a piece of damaged 18th century brocade, she felt a subtle but seismic shift within her. Her hands were not trembling. The work, once a refuge from life, now felt like an extension of it. She was not just mending the fabric. She was mending herself, not back into her old shape, but into something new, something stronger, woven with the unfamiliar, resilient threads of desire and survival. The fear had not vanished, but it no longer owned her. It was now a quiet, humming presence alongside a new, unyielding strength. The silence from Julian, which had felt like a verdict of her worthlessness, now began to feel like something else entirely. A cowardice that was his, not hers. She had met him in the ruins of his past and had not flinched. She had answered his brokenness with her own whole, terrifying truth. If he chose to retreat back into the safety of his cold, empty world, that was his cage to rattle. She had made her choice, not as a victim, but as a woman. And as she continued her work, each stitch a silent, deliberate act of creation, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not let his fear or her own be the final word in her story. The seamstress was done mending the lives of others. She was now ready to design her own. A week after the world had gone silent, a long, slender box arrived in the archives, delivered by a courier who seemed unnerved by the profound stillness of the room. It bore no return address, only her name, written in a sharp, decisive hand she recognized instantly. Inside, nestled in layers of acid-free tissue paper, was not a finished gown or a piece of jewelry, but a bolt of fabric. It was a silk, unlike any she had ever seen or touched. The color of a midnight sky just before a storm, it seemed to drink the light, and it felt like cool, living water against her skin. There was no note, no explanation. There didn't need to be. This was a piece of his soul, a raw material, an apology and a question woven into 1,000 silent threads. It was the language he knew best, not words, but pure, unadorned potential. It was an offering from his world to hers, a silent, desperate plea for her to create something new from the wreckage. For 2 days, she did not touch it. She simply let it lie across her workbench, a slash of midnight against the quiet order of her world. She studied it, learning its weight, its drape, the way it shifted from near black to the deepest indigo under the archival lights. Then, on the 3rd day, she took up her sharpest shears. The first cut into the fabric was a sound that echoed the breaking of her own past. She was not mending, she was creating. She worked without a pattern, her hands guided by a new, instinctual knowledge. This would not be a gown for a runway or a museum. This was for herself. She sewed with a fierce, focused passion, each stitch a reclamation of her own narrative. She was taking his darkness, his vulnerability, and weaving it together with her own strength, her own quiet integrity. The dress that took shape was not an object of seduction, but a statement of self, simple, elegant, and utterly unbreakable. She wore the dress on her ascent. The journey up the Croft Tower in the glass elevator was no longer a terrifying climb into an enemy's stronghold. This time she watched her own reflection not in a darkened subway window, but in the polished steel doors. And she saw a woman she finally recognized. Her hair was not bound in its severe knot, but fell in soft, dark waves around her shoulders. The dress, her creation, moved with her like a second skin, a whisper of midnight and defiance. It was armor forged in her own fire. When the doors slid open to the silent, cavernous space of his office, she did not hesitate. She walked across the marble floor, her soft-soled shoes making no sound, a ghost of the past now claiming her place in the present. She was not here for a verdict, or for an apology. She was here to deliver her own. He was standing by the vast window, a silhouette against the bleeding colors of the sunset, looking not like a king surveying his kingdom, but a prisoner staring at the walls of his cell. He turned slowly, as if sensing her presence, and when his eyes fell upon her, all the air seemed to leave the room. He did not see a model. He did not see an employee. He saw his own darkness, his own raw, unspoken pain, transformed by her hands into something of breathtaking, heartbreaking beauty. He saw the physical manifestation of a hope he had long ago murdered. His gaze dropped from her face, down the clean, simple lines of the dress, to the single, perfect seam that ran from shoulder to hem. It was a scar she had not hidden but had made a feature, a testament to the art of mending what is broken. It was a mirror of them both. He crossed the space between them, his steps stripped of their usual predatory confidence. They were the hesitant, uncertain steps of a penitent. He did not reach for her waist or her face. Instead, he reached for the seam on her shoulder, his fingers tracing the line of her stitching with a reverence that bordered on worship. He was not touching the fabric. He was touching her work, her decision, her soul. It was an acknowledgement of her power, an act of complete and utter surrender. "You didn't just mend it," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion she could no longer name as pain. "You made it stronger." In his eyes, she saw not the cynical sculptor or the wounded man, but the architect who had finally found the one person who could help him build a world he actually wanted to live in. She did not answer with words. She simply covered his hand with her own, her touch a quiet promise against the backdrop of the sprawling, indifferent city. The future was a blank pattern, an uncut bolt of fabric lying before them, its design unknown. There were scars that would remain, histories that could not be unwritten, but for the first time, standing in the heart of the world she had once feared, Elara Vance felt no need for a shield. She was the seamstress, and he was the sculptor. Together they stood in the ruins of their solitude, finally ready to begin. If you believe that even the most broken pieces can be remade into something beautiful and strong, show your support by subscribing, liking, and sharing their story. Let us know in the comments if you think a love forged in scars can truly last.